The unforgiving sun beat down on the parched earth of the Arizona Territory, the heat of physical presence that shimmered above the cracked land. For Corwin Corey Hale, a man whose spirit was as weathered as his leather chaps, this unforgiving landscape was both his home and his adversary. His ranch, the Hale's Throw, was a testament to his daily struggle, a small pocket of defiance against the vast, indifferent wilderness. It was this relentless battle for survival that led him on a blistering afternoon in late August of 1888 to the skeletal remains of the old Black Creek train station, a place the locals had long since surrendered to the encroaching desert. He wasn't there by choice. A stray calf, one of the few he had left, had wandered off, and its tracks led him to this forgotten outpost of civilization. A knot of unease tightened in his gut. This was no place for man or beast. The silence of the abandoned Black Creek station wasn't empty. It was a heavy, watchful thing, thick with the ghosts of forgotten journeys. For Corwin Hale, a rancher whose luck had run as dry as the creek itself, the silence was broken by a sound so faint it was almost stolen by the wind. A whimper. It was a sound that didn't belong in a place where only coyotes and memories roamed. Drawn by a force he couldn't name, he stepped into the gaping maw of the station's main building, and the sight that met his eyes would forever be seared into his soul. This is the story of that discovery of a struggling rancher who carried more than just 3 bodies from that desolate place. He carried a secret that would either be his salvation or his ruin. The air inside the station was thick with the dust of decay and the cloying scent of fear. As Corey's eyes adjusted to the gloom, the source of the whimper became horrifyingly clear. 3 figures, a woman and 2 young girls, were bound to a support beam, their heads lolling in the oppressive heat. Their dresses were torn and soiled, their faces pale beneath a layer of grime. The woman's eyes, when they fluttered open to meet his, were pools of exhausted despair. The girls, looking to be no older than 10 and 8, were barely conscious. A cold fury, sharp and swift, cut through Corey's weariness. Who could do such a thing? He fumbled for his knife, the worn handle, a familiar comfort in his palm, and sliced through the thick ropes that held them captive. The woman who he would later learn was named Lucia Miller. Crumpled into his arms, her body a dead weight. The girls, Emily and Clara, were too weak to stand. There was no time for questions, no time for anything but the primal instinct to save them. He hoisted the older girl, Emily, onto his shoulder, her small frame surprisingly heavy. The journey back to his ranch, a mere 2 miles, felt like an odyssey across a sun-scorched hell. The heat was a relentless hammer, and with every step the girls' labored breathing was a painful reminder of their fragile hold on life. He deposited her gently in the shade of a mesquite tree a short distance from the station and turned back. The second trip with Clara in his arms was a blur of sweat and straining muscles. The girl was lighter than her sister, but Corey's own strength was beginning to wane. He pushed on his mind a maelstrom of anger and a burgeoning unfamiliar tenderness. These were not his kin, not his responsibility. Yet in that moment, their survival felt as crucial as his own. Finally, he returned for Lucia. She had regained a sliver of consciousness, and her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, followed his every move. She tried to speak, her voice a dry rasp, but he shushed her gently. "Save your strength," he murmured, his own voice, rough with exertion. Lifting her was the hardest part. She was taller than he'd realized, and the dead weight of her exhausted body tested the limits of his endurance. As he carried her away from the station, a single chilling thought echoed in his mind. He had found them. But could he, a man who was barely keeping himself and his own son alive, truly save them? The weight he carried was more than just flesh and bone. It was the weight of their past, a past that had left them for dead in the desert, and the terrifying uncertainty of their future. The Hales Throw Ranch. His struggling sanctuary was about to become a haven for 3 lost souls, and in doing so, it would unknowingly invite a darkness that threatened to consume them all. The Hales Throw was not a place of comfort. It was a collection of weathered buildings huddled together as if for protection against the vast, empty expanse of the Arizona Territory. The main house, a modest 2-room structure built of rough-hewn timber, was where Corey and his 12-year-old son Caleb had carved out their existence since the passing of Corey's wife 3 years prior. It was a place of quiet grief and relentless work, a place where the line between survival and destitution was as thin as a razor's edge. The arrival of Lucia, Emily, and Clara shattered the fragile equilibrium of their lives. Caleb watched from the porch, his young face a mask of suspicion, as his father carried the woman and her 2 daughters into the house. He had been raised in a world of harsh realities, where every mouth to feed was another burden, and these 3 strangers were a burden they could ill afford. For the first few days, Lucia and her daughters hovered in a liminal space between life and death. Corey, with a gentleness that surprised even himself, spooned broth into their mouths and bathed their feverish brows with cool water. He gave them his own bed, a gesture that did not go unnoticed by Caleb, who was now relegated to a bedroll on the floor. As their strength slowly returned, the weight of their trauma began to manifest in other ways. The girls were plagued by nightmares, their whimpers and cries echoing through the small house in the dead of night. Lucia was a ghost in the daylight hours, her eyes vacant, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were wading through a thick, invisible fog. Corey, a man of few words, found himself at a loss. He knew how to mend a fence, how to track a stray, how to bargain for a fair price in town. He did not know how to mend a shattered spirit. He offered what little he could, a steady presence, a plate of food, the quiet assurance that they were safe. Caleb's resentment festered. He saw the way his father looked at Lucia, a look of concern that he hadn't seen since his mother was alive. He saw the dwindling supplies, the extra strain on their already meager resources. These women were interlopers, thieves of his father's attention and their precious food. He made his displeasure known in small, boyish ways, a slammed door, a sullen silence, a pointed refusal to acknowledge their presence. One afternoon, as Corey was out mending a fence, Caleb confronted Lucia. "Why are you here?" he demanded, his voice laced with an adolescent's bravado. "We don't have enough for ourselves." Lucia, who had been sitting on the porch, staring out at the unforgiving landscape, turned to him. Her eyes, for the first time, held a spark of something other than fear. "We had nowhere else to go," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Your father, he is a good man." "He's a fool," Caleb retorted. "A fool for taking in strays." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and cruel. Lucia flinched as if struck, but then a subtle shift occurred in her demeanor. The veil of victimhood began to lift, replaced by a flicker of defiance. She rose to her feet, her back straight, and for the first time, Caleb saw the woman she had been before the attack. A woman of strength and resolve. "Perhaps," she said, her voice gaining a measure of its former strength, "but even a fool can see when someone is in need." She turned and walked back into the house, leaving Caleb to grapple with a new and unsettling emotion, a flicker of shame. That evening, something changed. Lucia, as if awakened from a long slumber, began to take an active role in the household. She had a surprising knowledge of herbal remedies, a skill she had learned from her grandmother. She brewed a tea for the girls' lingering coughs and created a soothing salve for Corey's sun-cracked hands. She tended to the small vegetable garden with a natural aptitude, coaxing life from the dry, unforgiving soil. Slowly, tentatively, a fragile bond began to form. Corey found himself drawn to her quiet strength, her resilience in the face of unimaginable horror. Lucia, in turn, found a measure of solace in his steadfast presence, his unspoken kindness. The girls, sensing the shift in their mother, began to emerge from their shells. They started to follow Corey around the ranch, their initial fear replaced by a child's curiosity. Caleb, however, remained a holdout. He watched the burgeoning connection between his father and Lucia with a jealous eye. He saw her not as a survivor, but as a rival for his father's affection, a threat to the memory of his mother. One evening, as Lucia was humming a lullaby to her daughters, Caleb entered their small room. "My mother used to sing that song," he said, his voice tight with unshed tears. Lucia looked at him, her heart aching for the boy's pain. "She must have been a wonderful woman," she said softly. "She was," Caleb said, his voice cracking. "And you're not her." The words, though harsh, were not meant to be cruel. They were a cry of grief from a boy who had lost his world and was terrified of losing what little he had left. Lucia understood. She did not try to defend herself, did not try to placate him. She simply sat with him in the quiet understanding of shared loss, a silent acknowledgement that they were all, in their own way, survivors of a different kind of wilderness. The fragile haven of the Hale's Throw had weathered its first internal storm, but a far more dangerous tempest was gathering on the horizon. The town of Redemption was a microcosm of the West itself, a dusty collection of false-fronted buildings that housed both the promise of a new life and the ever-present threat of a violent end. It was a place of stark contrasts, where the hopeful prayers of the church on Sunday were often drowned out by the drunken brawls of the saloon on Saturday night. Corey rode into town on his bay mare, the dust of the trail clinging to him like a second skin. He had two purposes: to replenish their dwindling supplies and to report the attack on Lucia and her daughters to the law. He found Sheriff Brody in his office, a small, cluttered room that smelled of stale coffee and cheap cigars. Brody was a man who had seen too much of the darker side of human nature, and it had etched itself into the lines on his face. He listened patiently as Corey recounted the story of his discovery at the abandoned train station. "Tied up, you say?" Brody asked, his bushy eyebrows furrowed in thought. "And their wagon cleaned out. Everything," Corey confirmed. "They were left for dead. Any idea who did it?" Corey shook his head. Lucia was too weak to give a clear description, said there were 3 of them, their faces covered. Brody leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking in protest. "Sounds like the work of scavengers. Lot of desperate men out there these days." He ran a hand over his weary face. "I'll put the word out, but don't get your hopes up. These things, they're hard to solve." He looked at Corey, his gaze sharp and penetrating. "You be careful, Corey. Bringing them in like that, it might bring trouble to your doorstep." Corey nodded, a cold knot of apprehension tightening in his stomach. He knew Brody was right. He had not just rescued 3 people. He had inserted himself into their story, a story that had already proven to be violent and unpredictable. As he left the sheriff's office, he nearly collided with a man who was the very embodiment of Redemption's more prosperous side. Silas the Vulture Kane was a land baron who had built an empire on the misfortunes of others. He was a man of impeccable dress and predatory charm, his smile as polished as the silver on his saddle. He had been trying to buy out Corey's ranch for months, his offers growing increasingly insistent. Corwin Kane said, his voice smooth as silk. "Good to see you. I was just thinking about you." "I'm sure you were," Corey said, his tone flat. Kane's smile widened, but it didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "I heard you had some visitors." News traveled fast in a town like Redemption. "Just helping out some folks in need," Corey said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "A charitable man," Kane said, his voice laced with a subtle mockery. "But charity doesn't pay the bills, does it? My offer still stands, Corey. A fair price for a piece of land that's more trouble than it's worth. The Hale's Throw ain't for sale," Corey said, his jaw tight. Kane's smile finally faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "A man's pride is a poor substitute for a full belly," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You'd do well to remember that." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Corey with the unsettling feeling that their conversation had been more than just a casual encounter. It had been a warning. Meanwhile, Lucia, who had accompanied Corey into town for the first time since the attack, was experiencing her own jolt of terror. As they were loading supplies into the wagon, she saw him, a tall, wiry man with a distinctive scar above his right eyebrow. He was one of Kane's men, a hired gun, known for his ruthlessness. And he was one of the men who had attacked their wagon. The recognition was a physical blow stealing the air from her lungs. She stumbled back, a hand to her throat, the world around her tilting on its axis. The man's face, the leering grin, as he'd ripped her locket from her neck, the cold, dead eyes. It was all there, as vivid and terrifying as if it were happening all over again. Corey, noticing her distress, rushed to her side. "Lucia, what is it?" She shook her head, unable to speak. She couldn't tell him. To do so would be to put him in the direct path of Silas Kane, a man who had the power to crush him without a second thought. She had already brought enough trouble to his door. She would not be the cause of his destruction. "It's nothing," she finally managed to say, her voice trembling. "Just the heat." Corey looked at her, his brow furrowed with concern, but he didn't press the issue. He helped her into the wagon, and they began the long, silent journey back to the ranch. But the silence was not peaceful. It was filled with the unspoken fears that now lay between them. Lucia was no longer just a victim of a random act of violence. She was a woman with a dangerous secret, a secret that tied her to the most powerful and ruthless man in Redemption. The shadow of the past was no longer a distant memory. It was a tangible threat, and it was closing in on the fragile haven of the Hale's Throw. A week later, a lone rider appeared on the horizon, a speck of dust that slowly materialized into a man on a tired-looking horse. He rode with a slump in his shoulders, the posture of a man who had been on the road for a long time. As he drew closer, Lucia, who was hanging laundry on the line, felt a jolt of recognition. It was Amos Miller, her late husband's brother. Amos was a man who had always lived in the shadow of his more successful and charismatic older brother. He had a weaselly face and shifty eyes that never seemed to meet one's gaze directly. He dismounted, a pained expression on his face, and rushed towards Lucia, his arms outstretched. "Lucia, thank God I've found you," he exclaimed, his voice thick with a feigned emotion that didn't quite ring true. "I've been searching for you and the girls for weeks. I heard about the The attack. I was so worried." Corey, drawn by the commotion, came out of the barn, a wary look on his face. He was not a man to trust easily, and there was something about Amos's overly effusive demeanor that set his teeth on edge. Lucia, however, was caught off guard. In her vulnerable state, the appearance of a familiar face, even one she had never been particularly fond of, was a welcome relief. She introduced Amos to Corey, explaining that he was her brother-in-law. Corey, ever the gracious host, offered Amos a meal and a place to rest. He listened as Amos spun a tale of a frantic search of sleepless nights, spent worrying about the fate of his brother's family. He spoke of his deep affection for his late brother and his sense of duty to protect his widow and nieces. But as the days turned into a week, Corey's initial unease grew into a full-blown suspicion. He noticed the way Amos's eyes would dart around the small house as if he were searching for something. He saw the way Amos would corner Lucia, his voice low and insistent, only to fall silent when Corey approached. One afternoon, Corey was repairing a saddle in the barn when he overheard a hushed conversation between Amos and Lucia. Amos was questioning her about her late husband's inheritance. "He must have told you where he hid it, Lucia." Amos hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "It was a small fortune enough to set us all up for life. You can't keep it all to yourself." "There is no inheritance," Lucia said, her voice trembling. "My husband was a prospector, Amos. He had dreams, not gold." "Don't lie to me," Amos snapped. "He wrote to me, told me he'd struck it rich. He said he was coming back for you and the girls, that you'd all be living like royalty." The pieces of the puzzle began to click into place in Corey's mind. The attack on the wagon, the fact that they were left alive. It wasn't a random act of violence. It was a calculated act of terror, designed to frighten Lucia into revealing the location of a non-existent treasure. And the man behind it all was standing right in his own home, eating his food, sleeping under his roof. The full weight of Amos's betrayal crashed down upon Lucia. This was not just a greedy brother-in-law. This was the man who had orchestrated the attack that had nearly killed her and her daughters. The men who had tied them up and left them to die in the desert were not strangers. They were hired thugs, working for Amos. That night, after the children were asleep, Lucia confessed everything to Corey. She told him about her husband's last letter, his excited talk of a big strike, his promise of a better life. She told him how Amos had become obsessed with the idea of the inheritance, how he had hounded her for information she didn't have. "I didn't believe him," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I thought he was just a desperate man clinging to a false hope. I never imagined he would." Corey's heart ached for her. He pulled her into his arms, his hand gently stroking her hair. "It's not your fault, Lucia," he said, his voice a low rumble in her ear. "He's the one who's twisted by greed." The fragile haven of the Hale's Throw had been breached from within. The enemy was no longer a shadowy figure on the horizon. He was a guest at their table, a wolf in sheep's clothing. And Corey knew, with a chilling certainty, that the charade was about to end. The wolf was about to shed his disguise, and when he did, there would be blood. The revelation of Amos's treachery hung heavy in the air at the Hale's Throw. Corey and Lucia moved about their daily chores with a forced normalcy, a tense charade for the benefit of the children and the ever-watchful eyes of Amos. But beneath the surface a current of fear and uncertainty ran deep. Corey, now fully aware of the serpent he had welcomed into his home, began to watch Amos with a hawk's intensity. He noted the man's furtive glances, his hushed conversations with himself when he thought no one was listening. He saw the avarice that gleamed in Amos's eyes whenever he looked at Lucia, a look that had nothing to do with familial concern and everything to do with the phantom fortune he believed she controlled. Meanwhile, in the dusty streets of redemption, the gears of a more sinister plot were beginning to turn. Silas Kane, a man who had an ear for every whisper of gossip in the territory, had heard rumors of a hidden treasure, a prospector's lost fortune. The rumors were vague, but they were enough to pique his interest. When one of his men, the same scar-faced man who had given Lucia such a fright in town, reported that Amos Miller was now residing at the Hales Throw, Kane's interest sharpened into a predatory focus. He knew of Amos's reputation as a man of weak character and insatiable greed. He also knew that the man who had been part of the initial attack on the wagon had been hired by Amos. Kane summoned Amos to a clandestine meeting on the outskirts of town. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I know what you're after," Kane said, his voice as cold as a desert night. "And I know you've failed to get it." Amos, flustered and intimidated by the powerful land. Barron stammered a denial, but Kane cut him off. "Don't play me for a fool, Miller. You hired a couple of my men for a job you botched. Now you have a choice. You can either walk away with nothing, or you can partner with me, and we can split the inheritance." The offer was a devil's bargain, but Amos, desperate and out of options, saw it as his only path to the fortune he so coveted. He agreed to Kane's terms, sealing a pact that would have devastating consequences. Unbeknownst to them, their conspiracy had an unlikely witness. Caleb, his initial resentment towards Lucia having been replaced by a grudging respect and a protective instinct for his father, had grown increasingly suspicious of Amos. He had taken to shadowing the man his youthful curiosity and a growing sense of unease, driving him to uncover the truth. He had followed Amos into town that day, his small pony keeping a safe distance behind. He had watched from behind a cluster of barrels as Amos met with Kane, his young ears straining to catch their whispered words. He didn't hear everything, but he heard enough: inheritance, the widow, the ranch. A cold dread washed over him. He finally understood. Amos was not a concerned uncle. He was a predator, and he had allied himself with the most dangerous man in the territory. His father, Lucia, and the girls were in terrible danger. Caleb raced back to the ranch, his heart pounding in his chest. He burst into the house, his face pale, his eyes cut wide with fear. "Pa, it's Amos. He's in with Kane. They're coming for the money." The words tumbled out of him in a frantic rush as he recounted everything he had seen and heard. Corey and Lucia listened in stunned silence, their worst fears realized. The threat was no longer a matter of if, but when. Corey's face hardened, his eyes taking on the steely glint of a man who had been pushed too far. He was no stranger to violence. He had seen the horrors of war at Shiloh and Antietam, and he knew that the only way to meet a storm of this magnitude was to face it head-on. "We're not running," he said, his voice a low, determined growl. "This is our home. We'll defend it." Lucia, her fear now eclipsed by a fierce maternal rage, nodded in agreement. She would not allow this man, this monster, who had already taken so much from her, to threaten her children again. A new alliance had been forged, one born not of greed, but of a shared determination to survive. Corey, the reluctant hero. Lucia, the avenging mother. And Caleb, the boy who had overcome his own demons to become the unlikely savior of them all. They were a family forged in the crucible of adversity, and they would stand together against the coming storm. The fragile haven of the Hail's Throw was about to become a fortress. The sun had barely begun its descent, painting the western sky in hues of blood orange and fiery red, when the first riders appeared on the ridge overlooking the Hail's Throw. They were a motley crew, a collection of hired guns and desperate men, their faces grim in the fading light. At their head were Silas Kane, his polished demeanor now replaced by a hold predatory focus, and Amos Miller, his weaselly face a mask of nervous anticipation. Inside the small ranch house, the air was thick with a tense silence. Corey, his old Civil War rifle in hand, stood at the window, his eyes narrowed as he watched the approaching horsemen. Lucia, her face pale but resolute, clutched a shotgun, her knuckles white. Caleb, his initial fear now replaced by a surge of adrenaline, was busy barricading the door with a heavy wooden table. The girls, Emily and Clara, were huddled in the corner, their eyes wide with a terror that was all too familiar. "Get down," Corey said, his voice calm but firm. "And stay down." The first shot shattered the evening stillness, splintering the wooden frame of the window and sending a shower of glass into the room. The siege had begun. What followed was a chaotic symphony of gunfire and splintering wood. Kane's men, confident in their superior numbers, charged towards the house, their whoops and hollers a chilling prelude to the violence they intended to inflict. But Corey was not a man to be underestimated. He had learned the brutal art of warfare in the blood-soaked fields of the Civil War, and he used that knowledge to his advantage. He had chosen his ground carefully, the small house a natural fortress with limited points of entry. He fired with a methodical precision, each shot finding its mark, forcing the attackers to take cover. Lucia, to Corey's surprise and admiration, proved to be a formidable ally. The woman who had arrived at his doorstep, a broken and terrified victim, was now a fierce defender of her children, her shotgun barking defiance at the men who sought to harm them. She fought with a raw, primal instinct, a lioness protecting her cubs. Caleb, too, played his part. He scurried back and forth between his father and Lucia, reloading their weapons, his small hands working with a speed and efficiency that belied his age. He was no longer a resentful boy, but a soldier in a desperate battle for survival. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling the air. Kane's men, who had expected an easy victory, were now facing a determined and surprisingly effective resistance. Their initial bravado began to wane, replaced by a growing sense of frustration and fear. Amos, who had remained at the rear of the attack, watched the unfolding scene with a growing sense of panic. This was not how it was supposed to happen. He had envisioned a swift and bloodless victory, a simple matter of overwhelming a lone rancher and a helpless widow. He had not anticipated a full-blown gunfight. As the night wore on, the tide of the battle began to turn. 2 of Kane's men lay dead in the dirt, and another was nursing a wounded arm. Their ammunition was running low, and their morale was shattered. Kane, his face a thunderous mask of rage, realized that his plan had failed. He had underestimated Corey Hale, had underestimated the fierce resolve of a man defending his home and the woman and children he had taken under his protection. "Fall back," he yelled, his voice raw with fury. "Fall back!" The remaining men needed no further encouragement. They scrambled back to their horses and fled into the darkness, leaving their dead and wounded behind. Amos, his dreams of a quick and easy fortune, now reduced to a bloody and chaotic nightmare, was frozen in indecision. He was caught between the wrath of the man he had betrayed and the fury of the man he had allied himself with. In a moment of sheer panic, he made a fatal mistake. He drew his pistol and charged towards the house, a wild, desperate cry on his lips. Corey, seeing the lone figure silhouetted against the moonlight, alzed his rifle. He did not hesitate. He fired a single shot, and Amos Miller, the man whose greed had set this tragic chain of events in motion, fell to the ground, his lifeblood seeping into the thirsty Arizona soil. A deathly silence descended upon the Hales' throw, broken only by the whimpering of the two young girls in the corner. The siege was over, but the cost had been high. The fragile haven had been defended, but it was now stained with the blood of their tormentor. And in the darkness, a wounded and vengeful Silas Kane was already plotting his revenge. The final echoing crack of the rifle shot gave way to a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. It pressed in on them thick with the acrid smell of spent gunpowder and the metallic tang of spilled blood. Inside the besieged ranch house, the world had shrunk to the space of a single ragged breath. Corwin Hale stood frozen at the shattered window, his rifle still warm, his gaze locked on the dark shape sprawled in the moonlight. He felt no triumph, only the hollow, aching emptiness that follows unnecessary violence. Lucia's shotgun clattered to the floor as the last of her adrenaline fled, leaving her limbs trembling and weak. She stumbled towards her daughters, collapsing to her knees and gathering their small, quivering bodies into an embrace so fierce it was almost painful. She buried her face in their hair, drinking in the scent of them, reassuring herself they were real, they were whole, they were safe. Caleb, his face a ghostly pale mask, smudged with soot, slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, his young mind struggling to process the chaotic symphony of terror and gunfire he had just survived. He had faced down death alongside his father, and the boy who had existed at sunset was gone forever. "It's over," Corey said, his voice a low, rough rasp. He turned from the window, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion meeting Lucia's. "But he might come back. Kane." The name hung in the air, a promise of a threat not yet extinguished. A new kind of watch began. Corey sent Lucia and the children into the relative safety of the back room, while he remained the stoic guardian at the front. The hours until dawn stretched into an eternity. Every skittering sound from the desert, the call of a distant coyote, the rustle of a tumbleweed sent a fresh jolt through his frayed nerves. He sat in the darkness, the rifle resting across his lap, and thought not of the men he had shot, but of the woman and children sleeping fitfully in the other room. He had brought them here a simple act of mercy, and in doing so had invited a war to his doorstep. He felt no regret. For the first time in years, the crushing loneliness of his existence had been replaced by a fierce, terrifying, and deeply profound sense of purpose. Just as the first pale grey light of dawn began to bleed across the eastern horizon, a new sound reached him, the rhythmic drumming of approaching hoofbeats, many of them. Corey's body went rigid. He moved silently to the door, peering through a crack in the splintered wood. His heart hammered against his ribs. Had Kane regrouped so soon? But then he saw the familiar weary slump of Sheriff Brody in the lead, a posse of 6 grim-faced townsmen riding behind him. A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees washed over Corey. Brody's posse reined in their horses, shifting nervously at the smell of death. The sheriff dismounted his boots, crunching softly in the dirt. His old tired eyes took in the entire scene, with a lawman's practiced gaze, the 2 bodies near the porch, the still form of Amos Miller, further out the bullet-pocked walls of the small house. He looked at the blood trail leading away from the house, then back at the door where Corey now stood. Brody gave a slow, respectful nod. He'd known Corey Hale for years as a quiet, struggling rancher. He hadn't known he was a fortress. "Corwin," Brody said, his voice gravelly. "Looks like you had a busy night." The story tumbled out, Corey's words terse and factual. Lucia's voice trembling but firm as she corroborated every detail. The posse, listening in stunned silence, soon found a wounded and delirious Silas Kane hiding in a shallow ravine, his fine coat torn and stained, his arm crudely bandaged. When they hauled him to his feet, his arrogance had curdled into a venomous rage. His cold eyes found Corey burning with a promise of future vengeance. "This isn't over, Hale," Kane hissed, his voice a low snarl. "I own this territory. I'll see you and your new family in the ground." Brody, his patience for such men, worn thin by a lifetime of cleaning up their messes, shoved him forward. "The only thing you'll be owning is a cell, Kane," the sheriff retorted, the sound of the iron shackles clicking shut, feeling like a final punctuation. "Or a rope?" Kane's captured henchman, faced with the prospect of a noose, confirmed everything his confession, painting a clear picture of Amos's greed and Kane's predatory opportunism. Caleb's bravery was no longer a son's tale, but a confirmed fact. As Brody and his men led their prisoners away, a fragile, exhausted peace settled over the Hales' throw. The neighbor who had ridden for help returned with his wife, and together they helped Lucia tend to the children and begin the somber task of setting the house to rights. Corey and Caleb worked outside their movements, synchronized in a shared, unspoken understanding. They replaced the shattered door, boarded the broken window, and erased the most gruesome signs of the battle. Each nail hammered home felt like an act of reclamation, a defiant stand against the chaos that had tried to consume them. That evening the house was quiet. The fire in the hearth pushed back the lingering chill, its warm light a comforting beacon in the darkness. They were all bone-weary, but they were together, a small island of survivors. It was then that Lucia, her face illuminated by the dancing flames, decided the time for secrets was over. "There was an inheritance," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the still room. Corey and Caleb looked at her, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "But it wasn't what Amos thought. My husband, Thomas, he was a good man, Corey. A dreamer, but a practical one. He saw what the promise of gold did to men. He saw it turn friends to enemies, saw it hollow out their souls with greed." She paused, her gaze distant, as if seeing her late husband's face in the flames. "He found gold, not a king's ransom, but enough. Enough for a new start, a real home. But he was afraid for me, for the girls. He knew that if anything happened to him, we would be vulnerable. So he created a test." She rose from her chair and walked to the massive stone hearth. Kneeling, she braced her hands against the edge of one of the large flat stones set in the center. With a grunt of effort, she pried it loose. The stone scraped against its neighbors, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. Beneath it lay a dark, hollow space, and nestled inside was a small, tightly bound canvas bag. Lucia lifted the bag. It was heavy, dense with promise. "He wrote to me that he was hiding it in a place where it would be found only by someone who helped us for the right reasons. Someone who showed they valued life more than gold. It was a test of character." Her stormy eyes, shimmering with unshed tears, found Corey's. "That person, Corwin Hale, she whispered, her voice thick with a profound, unshakable gratitude, "is you." She held the bag out to him. He could only stare at it, then at her face, seeing not just a gift of wealth, but a gift of absolute trust. He slowly reached out and took the bag. Its weight in his hands was the weight of a future he had never dared to imagine. It was the weight of a second chance. The ghosts of the past had finally been laid to rest, not by the gun, but by the quiet, unwavering faith of a woman who had gambled on the goodness of a stranger, and won. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting a flickering golden light on the impossible treasure spilled across the rough-hewn floorboards. The nuggets gleamed with a life of their own, each one a condensed piece of sunlight, a silent promise of a future that just hours before had been an unimaginable dream. Corwin Hale stared at the gold, then at Lucia, his mind struggling to reconcile the bloody reality of the siege with the miraculous fortune now lying at his feet. The weight of it felt heavier than any burden he had ever carried. He reached down his calloused fingers, hesitating before touching a large, smooth nugget. It was cool and solid real. He shook his head, a gesture of profound disbelief. "Lucia, I can't," he rasped, his voice thick. "This is yours. It was your husband's legacy to you and the girls." He started to push the gold back towards her, a sense of honor warring with the desperate hope blooming in his chest. Lucia placed her hand over his, her touch gentle but firm, stopping his motion. Her stormy eyes, now clear and full of an unshakable resolve, met his. "My husband's legacy was not this gold, Corey," she said softly, her voice resonating with a wisdom born of immense suffering and loss. "His legacy is his daughter's. This," she gestured to the gold, "was his provision, and he was a cautious man. He knew its power to corrupt. His letter to me, it was clear. The gold was to be a tool, a foundation for the person who proved worthy of our trust, who helped us not for reward, but from the goodness of their heart. It belongs here at Hale's Throw. It belongs to this family. To us." The way she said "us" resonated deep within Corey's soul, settling the conflict that raged there. In her eyes he saw not charity, but a partnership. He saw the end of his solitary struggle and the beginning of a shared journey. He gave a slow, solemn nod, accepting not just the gold, but the profound trust that came with it. The gold was a catalyst. The very next week, Corey rode into redemption, but he was not the same man who had previously haunted its dusty street. His shoulders slumped with the weight of near destitution. He rode tall, the quiet confidence of a man with a future radiating from him. He walked into the land office, the same office where Silas Kane had once held court, and bought the adjoining 200 acres of grassy pasture land, paying in gleaming gold. The clerk who had known Corey for years as a man living on the edge of credit could only stare his jaw slack. A new herd of Hereford cattle, thick-bodied and healthy, soon grazed on that land. Corey hired 2 trustworthy ranch hands brothers named Eli and Marcus Vance, men whose quiet competence eased the relentless physical burden that had nearly broken him. The constant gnawing worry that had been his companion for so long began to recede, replaced by the deep satisfaction of building something that would last. But the most profound transformation occurred not in the fields, but within the walls of the ranch house. The silence, once heavy with grief and fear, was now filled with life. The house itself seemed to breathe again. Caleb, who had seen Lucia as a threat to his mother's memory, now saw her as the fierce woman who had stood beside his father, shotgun in hand. He shed the last of his boyish resentment and stepped into the role of an older brother with a natural, unforced grace. He spent hours with Emily and Clara, teaching them the ways of the ranch. He showed Emily how to braid a leather lanyard, his movements patient and sure. He took Clara to the creek, her squeals of delight echoing through the cottonwoods as he taught her to skip stones across the water's surface. He was no longer just Corey's son. He was their brother. The girls, nurtured by this newfound security, began to shed the trauma that had held them captive. The haunted, vacant look in their eyes was replaced by the bright spark of childhood curiosity. Their laughter, once a rare and precious sound, became the daily music of the Hale's throw. They were healing their resilience, a testament to the safety and love that now enveloped them. Between Corey and Lucia, a love that had been forged in the crucible of shared danger, now deepened in the quiet peace of their shared life. It was a love that lived in the unspoken moments. It was in the way he'd look up from mending a harness to find her watching him from the porch, a soft smile on her lips. It was in the way she'd bring him a cool cup of water in the heat of the day, her hand lingering on his for just a moment longer than necessary. It was in the evenings after the children were asleep, when they would sit on the porch swing, the gentle creak a rhythm to their quiet conversation, sharing stories of their pasts, not as burdens, but as the winding paths that had against all odds led them to each other. One crisp autumn afternoon, the sinking sun bathed the valley in a palette of deep orange and soft violet. The scent of pine and rich earth hung in the air. From the porch, Corey and Lucia watched Caleb patiently helping the girls fill a trough for the horses. The scene was one of perfect mundane peace, a peace Corey had thought was lost to him forever. "I never thought I'd find this again," Corey said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper against the vastness of the landscape. "A home, a family." Lucia leaned her head on his strong shoulder, her hand finding his, their fingers lacing together in a familiar, comforting fit. "We found it together," she affirmed softly. He turned to her. Then his rugged face, so often a mask of grim determination, now softened by an emotion so powerful it seemed to radiate from him. All the fear, all the struggle, all the bloodshed had led to this single perfect moment of tranquility. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones what he had to do. "Lucia Miller." He began, his voice thick with a sincerity that was more eloquent than any poetry. He gently squeezed her hand, his gaze holding hers. "Will you marry me?" Lucia's breath caught in her throat. For a moment she couldn't speak. Tears welled in her eyes, but these were not the tears of sorrow or fear she had shed in this valley. These were tears of overwhelming joy, of a relief so profound it washed through her entire being. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. Her answer a choked, breathless, "Yes." The Hale's Throw Ranch was no longer just a struggling piece of land. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It was a place where a widowed mother, 2 orphaned girls, a grieving boy, and a struggling rancher had against all odds become a family. They were a new beginning, written not in ink on a deed, but in the unbreakable bonds of love and courage, their future as bright and promising as the endless Arizona sky. The story of Corwin Hale and the Miller family is more than just a tale of survival in the Old West. It's a reminder that even in the most desolate of landscapes, in the face of unimaginable cruelty, the seeds of hope can take root. It's a testament to the fact that family is not always defined by blood, but by the bonds we forge in the fires of adversity. Their journey from the abandoned train station to a new beginning at the Hales Throw Ranch reminds us that courage can be found in the quietest of hearts, and that even the most broken of spirits can be mended by compassion. If their story of resilience and redemption has touched you, please take a moment to like this video. Share it with others who appreciate tales of the human spirit, and subscribe to our channel for more stories from the untamed heart of the Wild West. Your support allows us to keep these echoes of the past alive.